What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, June 12th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we're going to talk about the four-game early slate today. I haven't had a chance to take a look at the main slate, so not going to get to that one today. But we do have a four-game early slate on both DraftKings and FanDuel that we can take a look at. No weather concerns on this one, so that's nice. And these four gamers are generally pretty interesting to talk about. Obviously, you can play any offense, any pitcher, essentially, on a slate of this size, but you can get into the strategy a little bit more, and we're going to talk through that. Going to try and keep this show as brief as I can so that we do have time to make lineups afterwards. But as always, if you have questions, throw them in chat. I'll get to the ones that I see and that I have an answer for. So starting with the Rockies taking on the Minnesota Twins tonight or today in Minnesota. Really, really good spot for Pablo Lopez. He has been a very good pitcher this year. I think that there's maybe a tendency to be a little bit gun shy with him just because he has had some tough matchups recently that haven't necessarily resulted in the best fantasy performances. So I think at least for me, there's a tendency, when I see like, oh, I'm going to be playing Pablo Lopez today, it doesn't feel great. But, you look at the teams that he's faced most recently. He faced the Yankees in Yankee Stadium, got lit up, negative fantasy points in that one. But that's one of the best offenses in baseball. Prior to that, he actually had a good fantasy outing, but faced Houston in Houston. Very, very good offense. Very difficult team to strike out. He struggled in a few starts before that one. One against Texas in Minnesota. Texas not the same team so far this year that they were last year, but still a good team. Washington, he struggled. Washington's easily the weakest offense that he's faced recently. And then he struggled 5 starts ago, but again, that was against the Yankees. So you've had this stretch where, for the most part, Lopez has had difficult matchups, and he has struggled a little bit, but it's also driven his price down some. He's now $8,500 on DraftKings in one of the best matchups you can get, going up against the Colorado Rockies outside of Colorado. Obviously, it's baseball. Anything can happen, but this sets up about as well as it can for Pablo Lopez. It's a nice improvement in opponent from his perspective, going up against the Rockies. 5th highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. 81 WRC plus. And I've mentioned it a couple times before, but also the full context of Colorado ranking 5th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. That's not park adjusted. This team plays their home games in a park where it's very difficult to strike out. Coors Field is one of the most difficult parks to get strikeouts as a pitcher. So they're playing roughly half their games there, and they still rank 5th in strikeout percentage. If they played all their games outside of Coors, they would probably lead the league in strikeout percentage. So it sets up as a really, really good spot for Lopez. And it's obviously not sneaking by anybody. You can see here that he is projected for about 60% ownership. He showed up as optimal 57% of the time for me. So I don't really have an issue with that ownership. I did just refresh weather. I guess I hadn't done that before the show. This game does have weather concerns now. I don't think it did when I looked earlier, or maybe I just misremembered. For now, I would be playing it. It is the first game. We will have a bit more information by then. But for right now, this does actually look like the one game that does have weather concerns. Looks like there's just storms in the general area. So probably going to be fine, but definitely something to keep an eye on before lock. Don't just, set your lineups now and then never look at them again. But assuming this game goes, Lopez looks absolutely fantastic. Austin Gomber on the other side does not. He's not a terrible pitcher. He's just not a very good strikeout pitcher. And even on a 4-game slate, he's not showing up all that often for me. Projected for 3% ownership, showed up as optimal 6% of the time. So sure, if you just need a low-owned pitcher, like he's probably technically going under-owned, but you're not trying to build actual optimal lineups in MLB. It's an impossible task. He's a very, very low probability play here. 17% strikeout percentage overall this year. Does get the park bump getting out of Coors Field. But, again, not a good strikeout pitcher. Not a terrible pitcher overall, like a 4.3 to 4.4 xFIP. He's somebody where, if you're playing a lot of lineups in a large field tournament, yeah, maybe you get to a little bit of Gomber just to be different here and there. But if you're somebody playing 1 lineup or 3 lineups or anything like that, I don't think that getting to Austin Gomber is anything that you need to worry about. The Twins are in a pretty good spot. Most stacks today are showing up pretty similarly. The Twins are one of them. They have a relatively high implied run total. This park is pretty much neutral for both right-handed and left-handed home runs. One thing to keep in mind with Gomber is that he does actually give up some power to lefties. He'll give up power to righties as well, but he's not one of these left-handed pitchers that is just lights out against same-handed hitters. So that's something to keep in mind. Looking at the Minnesota lineup, you have a good price tag on Carlos Correa batting second. Royce Lewis is really the only expensive bat in this lineup. He's batting third. He's really, really good. He's projected for 17% ownership, showed up as optimal 14% of the time for me. So that price tag isn't really prohibitive there. He's just like the only expensive guy here. Manny Margot is leading off. Now, there is pinch hit risk there. That is one thing to keep in mind with Minnesota. That is possibly one reason they're not showing up as a better stack for me than they are. You're going to get some of these right-handed bats going up against Gomber. And then once you get later into the game, you're going to be getting pinch hitters. If you look at the starting lineup, you don't have Alex Kirilloff. You don't have Max Kepler. You do not have Trevor Larnach. So you have no shortage of left-handed bats on the bench ready to come into the game as soon as a righty comes in. Manny Margot is a strong candidate to not finish this game. He is the most obvious. The guys that are right-handed that are definitely not getting pinch hit for are Carlos Correa, Royce Lewis, Byron Buxton. Castro is a switch hitter. So, like, he could get pinch hit for, but it would just be because, like, they would rather have Max Kepler hit in some big spot in the eighth inning than Willie Castro. But Margot's the obvious pinch hit candidate. Jose Miranda is up there. Don't have to worry about Vasquez, really. Like, he is right-handed, but his backup is right-handed. Vasquez is another one where, like, yeah, they might hit with Ryan Jeffers later in the game, but it's not for a platoon reason. But they do have left-handed bats on the bench that can come in. Correa's safe. Lewis is safe. Buxton shouldn't be going anywhere either. So that is, just one thing to kind of keep in mind with Minnesota. On the other side for Colorado, it is purely the negative correlation aspect if you're getting there. Pablo Lopez is a very good pitcher, as I said before. Overall this season, 26.3% K percentage, 3.42 xFIP. His xFIP is 2 full runs lower than his ERA. His FIP is about a run and a half lower. His Scherer is over 2 full runs lower. So he has been pretty unlucky as far as earned runs compared to what you would expect. His left on base percentage is only 64%. You expect that to be much higher going forward. So he's been unlucky at stranding runners. Just a really good pitcher. There's nothing about the Rockies that you're looking at and saying like, oh, I think they're going to get to Pablo Lopez because XYZ reason. If you're going to them, it is simply saying it's baseball and Pablo Lopez is going to get hit hard often enough that I want some Rockies just because I'm knocking off 60% of the field if it happens. Some updates in chat on the weather. Says it looks solid. Storms are south of the park. Okay, cool. Don't have to worry about that. General MLB question. Do they still pinch it if they're leading the game, for example, 5-0? Not necessarily. So that is one reason. Like, pinch hitting is really tricky. In some ways, I think that it gets ignored and overlooked. You'll see it a lot. This cheap hitter like Manny Margot is leading off and he's cheap. So he's a great value because this team has a high run total. But if this game is close after 5 or 6 innings, he's probably coming out of the game. But other times I think it can kind of get overstated because if you're stacking this team, you're hoping that they just throw like 8 runs on Austin Gomber. And if this is like an 8-0 game and the Rockies bring in some right-handed reliever in the 5th inning, there's a pretty good chance that Minnesota is just like, yeah, cool, we can give Kirilloff or Kepler or whoever the rest of the day off because we don't need it. So there is kind of a sliding scale there where if it's like, a 3-run game or something like that, he's probably coming out. But if they really just light up the starter and get a huge lead, then you probably don't have to worry about it. So it's tricky. It's just something that I think you kind of want to keep in mind. As like if you're playing like 1 lineup or 3 lineups, I kind of view it as like a tiebreaker, especially if the player is projected to be popular. In this case, you're projected for 28% ownership to Manny Margot. So I do like, keeping in mind, okay, 1/3 of the field almost is rostering this guy that really might get 2 plate appearances. On the other hand, if he were low owned, then I wouldn't care as much because if the team I'm stacking goes off, then he might just stay in the game. And obviously he can do damage in a couple of at-bats anyway. So it is just something to keep in mind as a tiebreaker. As a max entry player, it's something that I would want to keep an eye on just to make sure that, I'm not just jamming in this supposedly good value play that that is relatively likely to get pitch hit for. So yeah, it's just something that I think is important to keep in mind. There's, I think, different ways that you can handle it. Carter said, I play a lot of cash games. I noticed that all of my opponents are playing the exact same lineup. Yeah, you just have people using the same projections. there's a lot of publicly available projections. If people are just using the most popular ones, they're going to get the same cash lineup because they're just playing the highest projected lineup from those projections. Moving on to the next game, we have the Blue Jays taking on the Milwaukee Brewers. High implied run total, or high actual total rather, in this game. Tobias Myers is going for the Brewers. Chris Bassitt on the mound for Toronto. Bassitt projected for 24% ownership. Showed up as optimal about 22% of the time for me. It's a very scary matchup for him going up against Milwaukee. This park is good for hitting. Milwaukee has a ton of power in their lineup. They are running a pretty left-handed lineup as well, which is a pretty big issue for Chris Bassitt. His splits this season are drastic. 27.2% K percentage against right-handed hitters this year, allowing a 254 expected WOBA and a sub 100 expected ISO. Those are elite numbers. And if he could just face right-handed hitters, his overall numbers this year would look much better than they do. Lefties have only struck out 15.6% of the time against him, 212 expected ISO, 403 expected WOBA. I understand why he is getting ownership here. And like I said, he is showing up in, 22% of optimal lineups for me. It's a 4-game slate. You only have so many options. This is a really, really scary spot for Bassitt. When you look at the Milwaukee lineup and really think through it, Bryce Turang is left-handed, batting leadoff. Christian Yelich batting third, left-handed. Sal Frelick batting fifth, left-handed. Jake Bauers batting sixth from the left side. Oliver Dunn batting eighth. Blake Perkins batting ninth. They will both be hitting left-handed here as well. So you only have 3 righties in this lineup, and 2 of those righties are William Contreras and Willy Adames. So you're really not getting, and the third is Jackson Chourio, who obviously he's had some struggles as a young rookie, but he's clearly talented. You're not getting any like right-handed cakewalk strikeout type matchups here. You can say Chourio is a positive matchup at this point. Fine. I'm not going to argue that. But like when the only guys or 2 of the 3 guys that you need to dominate to have success in this spot based on your massive splits are Willy Adames and William Contreras, it is really, really scary. So I think Bassitt is fine. Like I said, it's on DraftKings specifically, the 2-pitcher site at 8K. I don't have any problem with it because you just need to roster pitchers. But this sets up as a really, really scary spot for him. Tobias Myers on the other side, going a little bit under-owned at 4 to 5%, but a low probability play as well. Showed up as optimal about 9% of the time for me. He is only $6,000. He did throw 100 pitches in his last start, so he is fully stretched out. If he's pitching well, he can keep going. All of that stuff is good, and why, I think he's going a little bit under-owned, but the matchup against Toronto is not very good. The Blue Jays are a very difficult team to strike out. Against right-handed pitching so far this year, they have the 3rd lowest strikeout percentage, only striking out more often than Cleveland and San Diego. They have a 102 WRC+. That number is likely to increase going forward as well because they do have some established veterans that got off to very slow starts this season. They also no longer have Kevin Biggio pulling it down. So it's a tough spot for Myers. I think at that salary, again, if you're playing, it's kind of like Austin Gomber, like a better Austin Gomber in terms of talent. But if you're playing a lot of lineups and you're getting to some of him to be different, that's fine. But if you're playing 1 lineup or 3 lineups, I wouldn't be expecting Tobias Myers to be somebody showing up for me. Both of these offenses are going to look pretty appealing. Toronto showing up first, Milwaukee showing up second as far as all stacks go. Milwaukee showing up third in 5-man stacks. And I like it. Toronto against Myers, not the best matchup, but not one that I'm looking to shy away from. He's given up a ton of power to righties so far this year. Small sample, only 304 pitches thrown, but a 268 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters, only 134 to lefties. Does have a higher strikeout percentage by about 9 points to righties. So again, it's not that it's a great matchup. He's striking them out like 26% of the time, but he is giving up a lot of power when he allows you to put the ball in play. You have Schneider, Bichette, Springer, Kirk. All these guys have power from the right side. Guerrero is, I guess, not in the lineup today. But yeah, there's right-handed power here. From the left side, you have Daniel Vogelbach at 2,900 hitting cleanup. Very, very obvious pinch hit risk there. When you get if you get a lefty coming in, he's probably coming out of the game. Now he is sandwiched the way this lineup is constructed. If you bring in a lefty to face Vogelbach, that lefty also has to face George Springer and Alejandro Kirk. So it makes it difficult depending on the situation. It makes it less likely that happens. Like if you're just getting Vogelbach leading off the 6th inning, they're probably not going to bring a lefty in to face him. When they would do it is if he's up in like a big RBI spot, which sucks for DFS because let's say it's the 5th inning or the 6th inning and Daniel Vogelbach is up with the bases loaded and 2 outs, you're probably bringing a left-handed reliever in and Daniel Vogelbach is probably coming out of the game. And obviously that's like the at-bat that you really, really want to have if you're rostering him. So there is some pinch hit risk here in Vogelbach, but he is cheap. He is batting cleanup. He is getting 22% ownership, showed up 19% of the time for me. Again, I do really like Milwaukee. One, because they match up nicely with Bassett. You just have all these left-handed hitters against a pitcher that really struggles with lefties. But you also get them negatively correlating with a pitcher that's going to be rostered by like a quarter of the field. So they're not a low-owned team. I wouldn't call them a contrarian stack. Like people aren't sleeping on Milwaukee on a 4-game slate, but their ownership looks pretty much correct relative to optimal percentage. And then you also factor in that negative correlation that isn't completely being accounted for here. And it makes them look really, really good. Whereas Toronto is more likely to succeed if you look at optimal percentages for their players, but they're getting way more ownership and they don't have that negative correlation piece. So I haven't built lineups for the slate yet, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. And actually, I'd be happy if I am getting to Milwaukee at a higher rate than the Blue Jays, even though, Bassett obviously is a more established pitcher than Myers is. Sam Rothstein in chat said, with a 4-game slate, do you still like 5-3 stacks more than 4-4 or 4-2-2? I personally don't really have a preference. I don't do anything with those. I use SaberSim, and SaberSim factors in correlation. So whatever as far as stacks go, whatever's showing up, I'm fine with playing because I know it's being factored in. If you're using something that isn't factoring in correlation, like just using a flat out optimizer or using a worse version of a sim, then I still would like to be as correlated as I can, but I would, relax my constraints. Like if on a main slate, you're just like, I only play 5-3 and 5-2. I wouldn't go that route on a 4-gamer. Like you need to allow yourself to be getting those 4-2-2 and 4-3 stacks. But I wouldn't say I have a preference other than like all things equal. I would still rather have the most correlated lineup that I can, but I don't personally do anything to change stacking settings because it just happens naturally for me. Because I use Sims. Houston taking on San Francisco. This one is a weird one to me. Houston's showing up a bit more than I would expect them to or really want them to, but two good pitchers here that are not quite as popular as some of the alternatives. Logan Webb going for the Giants. Framber Valdez is on the mound for Houston. Neither of these guys are good strikeout pitchers, but they are both good, very good real-life pitchers. Logan Webb, 20.7% K percentage this year, 3.09 xFIP. Framber Valdez striking out 19.8% of hitters, 3.29 xFIP. Very good at keeping the ball on the ground, good at limiting power. Valdez had a much higher strikeout percentage last year as well. It has come back down to earth this year. And in the past, he had been a 21, 22% strikeout guy as well. So I do think it's likely that you see him kind of just settle into like that low 20s range as opposed to the upper 20s that we were seeing last year. But the salaries come down as well to 8,300. So both of these guys look like pretty good SP2s on DraftKings where you need the second pitcher. 8,700 on Webb is reasonable as well. The matchup with Houston is tough. This is a team that's very difficult to strike out. It is a good offense, but they are banged up. Kyle Tucker out. Yanir Diaz has missed the last couple of games. Don't know if he'll be in today. If he's out, you get a worse hitter in Victor Caratini. So it's a little bit weaker Houston lineup than usual. And again, Webb is he's good at preventing runs. And on a 4-game slate, it's not as big an issue that he's not great at getting strikeouts because you just don't have the same opportunity cost. You don't have as many alternatives that you can go to that are great strikeout pitchers. Like if you're looking at Logan Webb or you're looking at Framber Valdez here and you're saying, well, I don't want to roster them because they don't strike out a lot of guys. Great. Go find the guy not named Pablo Lopez or Michael King on this slate that does get a lot of strikeouts. If you tell me you're just playing Pablo Lopez plus Michael King lineup's fine. Like I'm not going to argue that. But other than that, there is no alternative that is a great strikeout pitcher on this slate. So it's not really a knock against them that they're like 20% K guys, given the other options. Now, offensively, I mentioned it. Houston is showing up a good amount for me. That surprises me a little bit. They do still have talent. They are reasonably priced. So I do get it from that standpoint. 5,500 for Yordan Alvarez, 5,400 for Altuve. Those are obviously expensive price tags, but they're also both very good and worth it. Other than that, though, like you can get to a talented Houston team for pretty cheap, where Bregman's 4,200, Pena's 4,100, Mauricio Dubon is only 3,200 if he's in the lineup. Jake Myers has been hitting towards the middle of the order at 3,400. So I do think Houston is interesting, and it's probably why they're showing up as much as they are for me from the standpoint of like, you can stack this team and then get to Michael King and Pablo Lopez and probably get pretty decent one-offs alongside them. So you're just playing that game of, yeah, the spot sucks for Houston, both in terms of the matchup against Webb and the park in San Francisco, but it's still a talented offense. And if they happen to come through, the rest of your team is just loaded up with good plays. So from that angle, I understand it. I assume that's why they're showing up as much as they are for me. Pretty much through the entire lineup, I just have their optimal percentage about double their ownership, which, again, you're not trying to build optimal lineups. But when I see a team like this that is talented, that is cheap, and that across the board, at least right now, is just projected to be under-owned, I do think they're a team I'm likely to be getting to in tournaments. And given that data, I would want to get to in tournaments. I don't want to get to the team facing Logan Webb in San Francisco, but I do want to get to the team that, when I run through all the data that I have, shows up as being projected for half the ownership that I think they deserve. So, not the highest probability team. They do come in behind Milwaukee. They come in behind Toronto in terms of chances of success, but I'm happy to get to them in tournaments given their current ownership. On the other side, San Francisco going a little bit under-owned as well, not to the same extent as Houston, though, because they just don't have the same level of talent. Framber Valdez, again, a very good pitcher. One other thing that does work in favor of Houston and San Francisco as well, you do get that negative correlation piece also. So you get, you have to stack against a good pitcher in Logan Webb, or if you're talking about the Giants, in Yordan Alvarez, but you do kind of get that extra added bonus of, if it works out for you, not only do you have a loaded lineup around your talented Houston stack, but a quarter of the field just lost Logan Webb also. So a pretty interesting team, I think, in tournaments. And then finally, we have the other very popular pitcher on the slate, Michael King, going for San Diego, going up against Hogan Harris for the Angels in San Diego. 54% projected ownership coming into King. Showed up as optimal 44% of the time for me at $9,000. So he looks very good. Again, you can see he's going a little bit over-owned, but he's still showing up as optimal nearly 50% of the time for me. So very, very high probability play. And he only takes up one spot in my lineup. I'm much more likely to just say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and play King, even though I think he's going a little over-owned. And then I can just use those Astros bats or Giants bats or whatever to differentiate my lineups, as opposed to saying, well, yeah, King's going to be optimal 40 to 50% of the time, but I'm going to just not play him and I'm going to play more Tobias Myers or whatever. Like the alternatives at pitcher are a lot less appealing than they are just finding other bats that are lower owned than a team like Toronto. So I expect I'll probably go that route where I just kind of eat the chalk pitching for the most part and then get to some lower owned offenses. I do think, just like, as is the case with Colorado against Lopez, if you're playing a lot of lineups, it makes sense on a 4-gamer to be getting to some Oakland bats where you're not playing King. Like if King is such a better strikeout pitcher than everybody on this slate other than Lopez, that if you're not playing him, you may as well be taking some bats against him and hoping that you get multiple home runs there, because if King has any semblance of a normal game, it's going to be difficult for these other pitchers to beat him because they just don't offer the same strikeout upside. So I do think on a slate like this, in your non-King lineups, getting to Oakland bats makes a lot of sense. Hogan Harris on the other side, brutal matchup with San Diego, 6.5% ownership, 6.5% optimal percentage for me. Just kind of is what it is. If you land on him across 150 lineups, sure. I don't anticipate getting to a lot of him, or I wouldn't anticipate getting to a lot of him. If I'm playing like 1 or 3 lineups, I wouldn't anticipate getting to him at all. And in an MME set, I still wouldn't anticipate getting to him much. Already kind of touched on Oakland, where I think from a negative correlation standpoint, where you don't have King, it makes sense. He has given up some power this year. I've mentioned it on shows recently too. This park has been great for home runs this season. I don't think it's likely to continue all the way through the rest of the season, but maybe there is some reason it's happening that I'm unaware of. King has allowed a 182 expected ISO to righties, 163 to lefties. He has struck righties out 30% of the time. So again, it's one of these situations where if you hit the ball against him, he'll let you, hit it pretty far, but you're just not going to make contact all that often. But you have Shea Langoliers potentially. It is a day game, so he could be resting. But if he's in the lineup, you have a high upside, good hitting catcher against the popular pitcher. Brent Rooker has power from the right side. So those guys, if you were to mini stack or just be grabbing one-offs, are the two that I would look to first. San Diego is going to look pretty good. Fernando Tatis getting a ton of ownership at 31%. individually probably going a little over-owned just because he's a hitter getting 31% ownership, but it is obviously a good spot against Harris. He is one of the most likely hitters to succeed. 19% chance of being optimal at 5,800 gives you stolen base upside in addition to his home run upside. Harris has allowed a 210 expected ISO to right-handed hitters since the start of last season. So, Tatis clearly looks good. But then you get some of these other Padres going, a little bit under-owned. Ha-Seong Kim projected for 9% ownership seems a little bit low. Luis Arraez, 7% ownership seems a little bit low. The middle of the order also probably going a little bit over-owned, but still guys that are pretty likely to succeed. Manny Machado at 5K looks pretty good. Ownership about where it should be. Solano, a little bit over-owned, but still a good value. One issue with Solano, but it's not as big a deal on a slate of this size. He has that first base, third base eligibility, but if you're stacking the Padres, unless you're intentionally looking to do this to be contrarian, you're probably not looking to play Solano at third base over Machado because you're just taking one of the most obvious guys that you want in your stack out. So that kind of in your stacks limits him to first base. And first base, generally, you can find power that Solano doesn't have. Now, on this slate, it's a little bit different. You don't have a great first base option from Oakland. You don't have a great first base option from Houston or from San Francisco. You don't have a great first base option from Colorado because they all suck. You don't have a great first base option from Minnesota. So this slate is a little bit different. I think Solano is a better first base play today than he is on most slates, just given that first base actually is really weak today on this 4-gamer. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Profar questionable. If he's in, he's been great this year. He looks like, good value in the outfield. So happy to get to the Padres. Obviously, we need to see that lineup. We need to see if Profar is in, but it is a good spot for them going up against Harris. Quickly to look on FanDuel, obviously the one pitcher site makes things different. So whereas on DraftKings, you had 20 to 25% ownership coming in to Logan Webb, Framber Valdez, Chris Bassett, they're all getting like 5 to 10% ownership on FanDuel. So on DraftKings, you're kind of, if you're playing a lot of lineups, just playing them some because you need guys not named Michael King or Pablo Lopez. On FanDuel, you can use them to like actively differentiate. All of these, Webb and Valdez both project to be under-owned here. Webb showed up as optimal about 17% of the time for me. Valdez showed up about 13%. Bassett's ownership more in line with his optimal percentage. Those are guys that, in larger field tournaments, you can just play them over Lopez and King, and they're going to come through often enough that it's probably a profitable pivot. That's not saying that like they should be your highest owned guys. You can see here the ownership on Lopez and King isn't too far above their optimal percentage either, so they look good. But they look like Webb and Valdez look like solid contrarian plays from an ownership standpoint on FanDuel, whereas DraftKings, they're owned pretty much where they should be. They're kind of just guys that are going to show up because you need to roster two pitchers on that site. So to recap, the clear top two pitchers on the slate, Pablo Lopez and Michael King. The next tier is Bassett, Valdez, and Webb. Contrarian stacks for me. Houston is showing up, which, I don't like the spot. I don't like the matchup, but all things considered, they're showing up as under-owned for me. I like Milwaukee quite a bit. They are getting ownership, but they're not getting as much as Toronto. And they do negatively correlate with the pitcher facing them. They have a lot of power. Their lineup sets up nicely against Bassett. There is pinch hit risk in that lineup. I didn't mention it specifically when we got to that game, but there is some pinch hit risk. Like Rhys Hoskins didn't start this game, but Yelich, you assume, isn't getting pinch hit for. Turang shouldn't be getting pinch hit for. Frelick certainly could. Bauer certainly could. Their lineup also, because it is so lefty heavy, like I said, it would be difficult to bring a lefty in to face Vogelbach with Toronto. You can bring a lefty in like to face Christian Yelich because they face the lefty Yelich, then they have to deal with the right-handed Adames, then they get a left-handed Frelick, a left-handed Bauer. So there is pinch hit risk for Milwaukee, but again, I think that overall it is a good stack, high upside spot, like getting to them. So that's all I have for you on this one. I'll be back tomorrow at the normal time at noon to talk about, I think I'll be back tomorrow. I'll tweet it out. I'm not positive. I think I'll be back tomorrow to talk about tomorrow's slate, but I will tweet that out for sure. Otherwise, good luck on today's slate and enjoy the rest of y'all's day.